John Pollock here alongside John Ramdeen and Robin Black. And on this date, February the 10th of 2007, EliteXC launched their first card from the DeSoto Civic Center. And in another trivia note, Mr. Ramdeen, you and I were here. It aired on Fight Network in Canada. And this card, it was headlined by Renzo Gracie and Frank Shamrock. But watching it that night and looking 10 years removed from the event, the fight people remember is Gina Carano and Julie Kedzie, and it was such a different time for women's mixed martial arts. Not the first promoters to promote women's MMA, obviously, but putting them on premium cable where they had to, essentially, Gary Shaw had to go to bat for the women with the Showtime executives, and this was at a time where they were gonna have three-minute rounds. They weren't even doing 5-minute rounds for the women, and here we are just a day away from UFC 208 where the women are headlining and could go 25 minutes.
Yeah, awesome part of history, but before Gary Shaw, we have to remember Jeff Osborne, who recently, had the last hook and shoot event. He profiled women's mixed martial arts, long before Gary Shaw. So got to give credit where credit's due. But Gary Shaw, he understood that it wasn't just, because a lot of people looked at mixed martial arts or no holds barred as a man thing, but to see Gina Carano capture the imagination of everybody, because you talked about that card. You had you had Shamrock versus Gracie. I'm sure a lot of people were tuning in to see Ken Shamrock versus Hoist Gracie. It's like, Ken Shamrock has a brother?
He looks different.
He looks different. And then on top of that, you had this new star, KJ Noons. This was the kind of the golden boy of Gary Shaw, taking on this kind of thuggy Charles Bennett. And what happens? Crazy Horse knocks out KJ Noons, the boxer. On top of that, you had Cabbage Carrera taking on Bigfoot Silva. On the undercard, one of the, in my opinion, one of the most talented fighters, Mike Pyle, on the card as well. So it was really, if you were a fan of mixed martial arts, this was a must-see event. And again, I had the chance, I was working security at Hard Rock Cafe, and after the event, I got all the staff and supporters of fights, and we ended up watching these. I had seen the fight, but everybody wanted to see Gina Carano and Julie Kedzie, and at the end of that night, everybody was on their feet and they were cheering especially because after the fight, the girls embraced, and we really got to see what mixed martial arts was all about. And that was the moment where I thought
it was pivotal on that first show to have a star, and Gina Carano felt like it after that.
100%.
It was the story of EliteXC centers around Gina Carano and Kimbo Slice.
While we're giving credit to people, Julie Kedzie deserves a lot of credit for her influence in the earlier days of women fighting.
And even now Invicta.
And now in Invicta. Julie is a great mind and a beautiful person and really, really skilled and really important to women's fighting at the time. I'm also surprised she didn't slap their little man heads for daring to say that our poor little woman bodies can only handle 3-minute rounds. Like, get serious. Julie and Gina Carano can fight just like as well and at a high level, and certainly with the conditioning of any man. That's almost insulting in retrospect that they had to fight 3-minute rounds.
You could definitely write a book on EliteXC, and I mean, they had it was just a story of excess and way too much and money being thrown around everywhere. Gary Shaw, there's positives, there's negatives, but that was a guy that understood appealing to an audience that maybe was not your hardcore MMA base, but tailoring cards around, 2-hour events. You open with your big heavyweight knockout fight with, that was where we would see a Brett Rogers or
Cabbage.
That's true.
Those style of fights.
And then you had Joey Villasenor, you had David Loiseau also on that card. Loiseau fought for a UFC championship. After he left, they were trying to bring in the biggest free agents they possibly could. So, in addition to entertaining fans, they wanted to make sure they had credible fighters. So it seemed that Gary Shaw, in addition to having the eye for entertainment, he also wanted to make EliteXC as credible as possible.
It is shocking, actually, the level of where the female fighting has gotten to. Of course, Gina played an enormous role. People like Julie, Gina, and of course, Ronda took it over the top. It wasn't even every woman fighting in the UFC has to thank Ronda Rousey. Nobody else was going to make Dana White see this thing the way it is. But now it's like main eventing Fox shows, and from the vibe I get, the Fox people prefer the women main eventing there. It's really unbelievable where that's gone.
Yeah, when you look at the fact of this little Showtime show and what it really promoted with the women, and then this past July, Holly Holm and Valentina Shevchenko, no Ronda Rousey involved here, and 4.6 million people watched that fight. And Robin's right. I mean, I think that's a huge reason, that number, why they went with Juliana Pena and Shevchenko in the main event over top of Donald Cerrone and Jorge Masvidal. I mean,
Which is crazy.
the women have a very impressive track record over this last year when it comes to drawing. So I guess in short here, as we just wax poetic here on EliteXC, I mean, what is the legacy of EliteXC for you, Ramdean? Because there was positive and negative, and ultimately this was a company that did self-destruct at the end and was done by just a year and a half.
What I learned about EliteXC and Strikeforce and some of these other mixed martial arts promotions, of course, Affliction and Pride and Shudo and Pancrase and all these different organizations, because people were looking at the UFC as, if you weren't in the UFC, you weren't a good fighter. The best fighters in the world fought for the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and EliteXC and these other promotions showed us that there are great fighters in all promotions all over the world, because after EliteXC folded, the UFC ended up bringing in a lot of these guys. So that's what it came down to. A lot of these promotions were trying to create competition for the UFC, and if you look at it from an individual show basis, don't look at how many tickets they sold, don't look at what their numbers were, just from an entertainment standpoint, I think it was a home run.
And if you want to try and tie all of this together, granted at the end it was CBS that kind of wanted to wipe their hands of MMA at that point, but when you look at Showtime getting into the business of mixed martial arts, when EliteXC disappeared, they got into it with Strikeforce. And had Showtime not had that commitment with Strikeforce, maybe Ronda Rousey doesn't necessarily have that outlet, because the UFC was not an option for women at that point. It could have been a very different history of mixed martial arts if Showtime doesn't get into the MMA space.
That's a great point. And the moral of the story is, fighting is the greatest thing ever.
That wraps it up for us. For Robin Black, John Ramdean, I'm John Pollock.